All right, we're recording. So we're on week 24. This is a continuation of the concepts that was presented last week, and we're going to go over a little bit of an overview. But these symbols we should be familiar with as we've gone through the LDS Temple Endowment. I won't share anything that we're under covenant not to disclose. I honor the covenants that I've made there and keep them. Fortunately, with culture, a lot of LDS people think you're not supposed to talk about anything. That's not true. And it's to our detriment that we're not talking about the symbolism, the rich symbolism in the temple that has been provided. And so with it, I want to go over and continue the different shapes and as they progress. And I'm hoping that it will expand your mind, help to get to the point of better understanding so comprehension will start coming in. As I've worked through these things over the years, I've personally viewed myself going through that whole pattern that we've discussed and that Denver has talked about in that plural marriage talk. But that sequence, that pattern that happens when we receive some truth and we labor to understand it and then comprehend it, and eventually we'll possess that knowledge and it will be a part of us and be sanctified in us. I've experienced that in many of the aspects of the temple endowment, but it takes some time to be able to ponder and piece things together and see what the Lord is really doing with all of these rich symbols that are found in the temple. And so I wanted to go over a quick review last week and just go over some of the concepts because it was a lot of material really quick. I didn't fill in all of the pieces last week either. I left some of that up to each of us to go through and connect some of the dots themselves, but some of the larger lines, so to speak, because it's this line upon line, precept upon precept approach. Some of the lines I connected, others are still there that we could personally connect ourselves. So I want to go over, last week we talked about the line, the half square, the full square, and the compass. And I also want to go over some symbolic concepts that are a part of what we reviewed last week. And then we'll get into some the new material and move into a different shape, so to speak, that is so rich, even richer than what we talked about last week. So anyway, I want to go over and read a section from the Second Comforter. It's chapter 11, and it's titled "Becoming as a Little Child." And I want to read this first, and I want to review some concepts, and then I want to play a brief 3-minute video clip of Denver explaining a concept in the John DeLynn interview on the Mormon Stories. It's the interview 321 that we all have access to. It's on Restoration Archives. And then I want to go over that, and then we'll move into this week's topic. So in that chapter, Becoming as a Little Child, chapter 11, it states, in ceremony, we move what was on the left side to the right side. The orientation of clothing changes from the one side to the other, forming a mirror image of progression and regression. As a husband and wife kneel between the mirrors of the ceiling room, facing each other, the right side of the one matches the left side of the other. As the dialogue at the veil concludes, the one acting as proxy speaks words of blessing vicariously for an ancestor, who in turn blesses descendants, including the one acting as proxy. The images and symbols fold over upon each other in a repeating pattern of chiasms. Symbol and meaning merge into patterns intended to suggest to the mind the deeper level of meaning. And this is what we're going to go over and kind of get these folding aspects and how these images fold over. What do we make of these symbols? These embedded messages seem to return to a theme. whatever the meanings as may be contained in these forms, patterns, and types, it necessarily includes the notion that to go forward, you must go backward. Perhaps this meaning reigns supreme over all the other symbolic meanings in the pattern. Do you hear that? This pattern also reminds us anew of the Lord's injunction, except ye be converted and become as little children, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. It's what was Matthew 8. He's quoting traditional scripture formatting. Returning to the mind of a child is necessary as a precondition, according to Christ's words, for us to be able to enter his kingdom. What is it about the mind of a child that makes him or her more suited to following Christ? Is it innocence? Certainly a child's mind is more innocent than the adult's, but innocence also accompanies the willingness or even the necessity to imagine things. Children are able to hold out the possibilities for Santa and the Tooth Fairies and Peter Pan. To a child, these things are possible. It requires failures and disappointments to form an adult mind. Those failings and disappointments make the adult mind skeptical and unbelieving. Things once held in honor by the childish mind become impossible to believe in adulthood. And so there's some amazing and important aspects as we are going to talk about shapes and symbols. And so I just want to go over and review some of the key bullet points that we just read right here. So in ceremony, we move what was on the left side to the right side. So what was on our left facing forward, moving right, we move from left to right. The orientation of clothing changes from one side to the other, forming a mirror image of progression and regression. You'll be able to see this in some of the symbols. And I graphically put together some stuff tonight that hopefully will help. So for us right-brained folks, so we'll be able to get it. Another aspect, as husband and wife kneel between the mirrors of the sealing room, facing each other, the right side of one matches the left side of another. The images and symbols fold over upon each other in a repeating pattern of chiasms. Whatever other meanings as may be contained in these forms, patterns, and types, it necessarily includes the notion that to go forward, you must go backwards. And then the last part here, returning to the mind of a child is necessary as a precondition according to Christ's words for us to be able to enter into his kingdom. So we all must become as little child or little children. Think of the doctrine of Christ. It's a core aspect, as we've been taught in 3rd Nephi, that we have to go there, and as Denver restated here. And then to move into this, as we are going to be talking about different shapes. Little children start their learning with their seemingly basic shapes. And that's how little children start. Or square. I could even hear it in my children's voice in the way they used to pronounce triangle and angle, and how they used to try to figure out a square or a rectangle or whatever, or a star. So we have these shapes that little children go through, they'll look at, and they'll mean something to the little children. Squares, triangles, stars, circles, pentagons, octagons. And so with that said, I'm going to crank the volume up here, and I'm going to play a little clip here and listen to how Denver states this, and then we'll start discussing some shapes here.
So where are you on the importance of authority, of priesthood, of rituals like baptism and the endowment to get into heaven? Do you see all of that as sort of punch passes that you need to go through to make it to the, to be exalted? Or do you see those as kind of bureaucratic distractions or side trips?
I think the purpose of the ordinances is to extend an invitation, that they are instructional. They are to initiate you into an understanding of a different culture than the one from which we hail, in order to get you mentally and spiritually adapted to looking at the way that God deals with man. Man's culture and man's ways are not, culturally, we are divided from God. When you go to more primitive cultures, in fact, we've even got the phrase "the magic worldview" that we have coined in order to describe the attitude that we think we're more sophisticated than, we can look down upon. Whereas in the teachings of the Savior, the more correct way would be the child's view, or becoming more childlike. Because we all remember in our childhood how believing we could be in all kinds of stories. Well, the purpose of the ordinances, in my view, is to initiate us into another way of viewing things, another way of opening ourselves up to receiving those kinds of influences which, if there is a God, and I believe that there is, he would have embedded everywhere. And therefore, ordinances ought to heighten our sensitivities and create within each of us an expectation, not merely that we're going to go through a ceremony in which it's depicted that we will encounter God through the veil, but that is a deliberate effort to invite us to experience the transcendent and to make the connection between ourselves and God through a veil, through that which apparently separates us, to reach up and to have him reach down and to make that connection. So I think the ordinances are educational. I think they are invitations. I think they are an extension of God's care, concern, and invitation to each one of us. And if we're received in that light, I think they serve a marvelous purpose in inviting us. They are not the real thing, but they are a depiction of the real thing and an invitation to receive the real thing, which involves God and man.
All right, let me crank down my volume here so I don't blast myself. So, make no mistake, what we're reviewing are symbols of higher ordinances. And I need to emphasize that. Through Joseph Smith, and it's kind of trickled down through Brigham Young, but they came from and stemmed from Joseph Smith and what he was able to piece together. These ordinances pertaining to the initiatory, the endowment, and the sealing, which is another aspect also, but they're shapes here that relate to higher ordinances. So I hope that the childish mind will come out. You'll allow yourself to revisit shapes, absorb it, receive it, so that we could start understanding and comprehending these shapes as we move forward. But they're an invitation to receive the real thing, and they really help us orient or get us oriented into these things. Now, another plug too, and we had this last week, but in the 10 parables, there is a parable directly related to concepts of shapes. And if you haven't read Triangularity, in chapter 3 in the 10 parables lately, it's quick. I mean, you could read it probably less than 10 minutes. But it goes over some of these symbols and even how the world reacts to certain knowledge that comes through these symbols, and so on and so forth. So just wanted to take it back there. So one last slide of review. And this is what we talked about last week. So the first thing that I want to remind us of what we talked about last week is this concept of line upon line. See these lines here? It's line upon line. and eventually it'll form a square. And then there's different angles that will be shown here. But I want to make sure that we understand what scripturally, what it means, line upon line. These symbols have been around. They are eternal symbols. And these lines that it's talking about are, or do pertain to that. And so in TNC 98:3, it says, "And I give unto you a commandment that you shall forsake all evil and cleave unto all good, that you shall live by every word that proceeds forth out of the mouth of God. For he will give unto the faithful line upon line, precept upon precept. And I will try you and prove you herewith. And whoever lays down his life in my cause for my name's sake shall find it again, even life eternal." And so this concept of lines that we're going to be talking that build certain shapes, we need to have a childlike mind to be able to say, oh, we need to revisit shapes. The shortest path between 2 points is a line. The line is a sign that represents that which is straight and narrow. Think about Lehi's and vision and what Nephi saw in that straight and narrow path. And 3rd Nephi, Christ stated, "For straight is the gate and narrow is the way that leads to life." And so I highlighted here, there is a line upon line, and think about these lines right here. There is a line upon line aspect to all of this that we're talking about. So think about line upon line and how we're supposed to comprehend first one line, then the other, then joining those together, then getting the other, and then joining them together according to the precepts pertaining to that ordinance. So number 2, the great competition. I wanted to review and make sure that we understand this in the 10 parables where he's talking about the great competition of us in that first estate and second estate type scenario where those that never experienced opposition needed to have the opportunity to go down, leave their first estate, enter the second estate, and receive instructions there. So, because it's the only existence that we could really receive and possess faith, and because you actually have to do in order to receive that power. And so part of this great competition and this spiritual creation, the birth and moving to death, it's a sign of our movement of descending to ascend. And what did Denver say previously? You have to go backwards in order to go forwards. So this first line represents a journey that begins at the top. This is celestial space. We have it right here. And it ends at the bottom here. And then we're supposed to traverse this life. And we'll get into more detail tonight about that. So the second line represents a journey that begins at the bottom and continues at the bottom and that ends at our body, so to speak. And we'll get into that. Then overcoming. We need to understand this whole thing about overcoming each level that we have as we go around. The first 2 signs, and this is sign 1 and sign 2, they begin, sign 1, level 1 begins in celestial space and then ends, as you go around, in celestial space. The first sign represents overcoming level 2 and joining level 3. This is where we're trying to figure out this Jacob's ladder thing. And it's as thin as a razor's edge. And there are instructions to be able to receive it. The second, let's see. Notice when the lines on the temple garment are uncovered and revealed in the endowment ceremony and we talked about it last week. We don't want to revisit it, but there's a shoulder. And when a robe is on a certain shoulder, there is a certain sign that is either uncovered or covered. And it's very, very important. And Denver mentioned it in this quotation that we just barely read right here in the second comforter. Then lastly, want to talk, we entered a new order. As soon as you start living according to the law, which is exact, all of a sudden a new order starts appearing. Think about Jacob's ladder starts appearing here. You'll start seeing new angles that represent a lot. So once we get to this point, a new angle is introduced. And up to the point that we left off on last week, only right angles have been used. And there must be a transition from being a preparatory priest after the order of Aaron to become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And there's this transition. And when we start seeing this view here, we start getting a concept of what our responsibilities are in this higher order of the priesthood. So we'll revisit some of these angles tonight also. And so that concludes the review, a brief review of what we did, what we covered last week. And I want to get now into the week 24 material and continue where we left off with this full square, meaning getting to the point of having both levels present and moving. This one should have said level 3. Glad I saw that. And so let's break this down really quick. If you're sitting in a place where these things are made manifest, you are looking forward. And there are these shapes that are being made manifest. This first sign right here, which is made with your arm, and you're supposed to do it with your body, that's what an ordinance is. You perform it with your body. A law are the instructions. The ordinance is what you're supposed to make manifest through whatever act that's done through your body. So the first sign is aligned with both to both level 1 and level 2. This is level 2 right here. I broke it in half. This is level 1, level 2, and this is level 3 going up. This sign ties the first and second estates together, right? The second sign, and I put arrows, and I hope it's not too cumbersome, guys. But the second sign given in the temple also contains a square, and this is the second sign. You're going to have to, in your mind's eye, and kind of review, and for some of us, it's been a while since we've had the temple endowment, but you'll have to kind of review mentally as we're talking about this, but there's a second sign given in the temple that also contains a square, right? These two lines, however, are slightly different. They are a mirror of the first. If there's a mirror here, it's a mirror of the first sign. So the second sign begins at the baseline, and the second point ends at the base. This makes the first line, right? And so this connection point, or what you call a junction, is another 90-degree angle. It's very, very significant. It represents a birth. This, when we come down from our first estate in the second, there's a birthplace here. This other right angle represents also another birth. It's another connection point representing an ending and a beginning, right? So the next line in the sign begins at the base and ends at the top. And I'm just walking you through it just to pause and to make sure, so that we could hear it and we could start assimilating it, so that we could start relating to it. And so both the first sign and the second sign deal with a cyclical journey that begins and ends in celestial space. We talked about it last week. You start here, and the hope is that you'll be able to get up to this celestial space again until you have another cycle of creation. And so it starts in the celestial, it ends in the celestial, and it's cyclical. And so here's some new information here. Both signs are met in the middle of our body. So the body is our key, is a key to understand. Our body is an object, or I put a tool, central to overcoming these two levels. And so the vertical lines that we have are crossing terrestrial space. When you get to this point, you come down, you descend in order to ascend. This is mortality here. These two vertical lines, these are horizontal, these are vertical, crossed terrestrial space. In the covenant, Denver mentions that the Lord has stated through Revelation that there is sacred space above, that at any time he could transact different ordinances whenever we need it. I just want to make sure that we understand that these two lines you have to be in a terrestrial space in order to do it. We talked about the great competition or the war in heaven, that it necessarily occurred in a terrestrial space and a millennial type space, even though that's the end of the cycle. And that the millennium also takes place in a terrestrial space. And so this second sign that we have may, and I say may, but this is something that I believe, be a reference to our journey up and through terrestrial space in a millennial type space that ends in that celestial space where our journey began. And I highlighted this in red. Each of the 4 signs revealed in the temple are given to represent overcoming one level and entering into the next. And we'll actually talk about all 8 levels tonight. And I would say and impress upon your minds that the word overcome itself indicates a period of trial and the promised reward for overcoming. Now, I didn't put the bullet points in here too, but I want to make sure that we understand the body of Christ. We spent a lot of time with the Temple of Solomon and mentioned it is in an exact representation of a body, of a man and a woman's body intertwined. And so the backbone, if you look through, is always the doctrine of Christ. It's the straight and narrow path that leads to the Holy of Holies up here. And in order to move forward along the doctrine of Christ and press forward, there has to be obedience, and the reward for obedience is the Holy Ghost. There has to be sacrifice, and the reward for sacrifice is faith, which results in the Spirit of Christ. So I just wanted to make sure I broke that down. It took some time. I had to find little figures and make it right, and I went through the effort so that we could able to visually see how it's all pieced together. And these are the first signs that are manifested in the temple. And so with it, I want to now move on to a different shape. We talked about the full square, and I want to introduce now what is called the diamond. And we'll get into that too. But I put together and I gathered and I stated it's a higher order that's largely ignored and overlooked by the world. But there are symbols of the holy order of heaven everywhere. And we're going to be reviewing just briefly each one of these. And I took some time to find all of the graphics and make it so our right brains could have an object to remember, to remind ourselves. And these are some of the best ones I could find. I'm sure there's different ones and there could be better ones, but this is what I was able to find to be able to represent this diamond shape and these 4 corners, so to speak, right? But there are symbols of the holy order of heaven that we should become familiar with. And we're going to get into that tonight. And so the first thing that I want to talk about is we're talking about the diamond, because before we have this shape right here, it's the square forming these 2 right here. I want to get in and talk about the diamond. It's shifted. So the diamond shape represents a lot of things, and the first thing that we're going to talk about are the 4 compass directions, which are really, really important, that orient us even throughout all of the scripture dialogue. The lost 10 tribes went to the north. The sun rises in the east. A lot of the stuff from the south we'll have to talk about. West is very, very important by way of relative direction, whether we're approaching God or we're moving away from God. But this diamond shape, one of the meanings of it is this compass. And there are 4 cardinal directions that tie into deep symbolic meaning, right? And once we shift this and make it and shift it 45 degrees, another angle is found. And we also find out that it is a symbol that's found in the temple garment, right? And so just to review what the directions are, and there's the cardinal points, and Denver represents, or he mentions the cardinal points and the cardinal directions. And so I want to go to just review, so in our minds, there's some substance behind the 4 compass directions, right? So the word cardinal is derived from the Latin name cardo. And so that comes from this Roman cities, and it's kind of like what they did in downtown Salt Lake City. But in Roman cities, they're the street traced from north to south and passing through the center of the city. So you get into all of these towns in Utah, and there is Center Street. And then there's North Temple and South Temple, or First South or First North, or all of that stuff. So it's kind of that orientation. With it, if you think about it, this means that the only true cardinal point, the only truly cardinal point, should be the north, and to a lesser degree, the south. Any movement to the east or the west pertaining to this, you'll have to look at these symbols to be able to uncover some of that. But the north is the direction that we should be focused on individually. The expression of cardinal importance is used to emphasize that importance of the direction of north, the north-south direction, right? And regarding the cardinal points, it is the north, which represents repentance with turning and facing truth. And where is the North Star? In the north. It's Polaris, even though there is going to be a change of the pole star. If you've been paying attention to what Denver has mentioned, the overlap started with Joseph Smith in his day, and we're getting to the point where there's a new heaven, a new earth. There's going to be a new pole star. And so our direction, that north, is going to point in a different direction, which is of great importance. And so there's this statement that that you hear, that a person has lost his north. It's when they've lost their way. They're not repentant. They're not looking and turning and facing truth. And of course, we all know these as north, south, east, and west. And then there's this Nordic mythology, and they have the names where these names were derived from, where these Nordri and Sudri and Ostri and Vestri, in all of those directions, that's where they come from. But they represent points and cardinal points on a compass. And on Denver's blog, in the 3rd Nephi 20 verse 13 commentary, that's the traditional reference, Denver states, do Joseph's remarks about the Lord coming to visit with the remnant in the Rocky Mountains explain how both those coming from the 4 corners of the compass will gain knowledge of the Lord their God, and also know he hath redeemed them? And so Denver represents those and mentions those 4 corners of the compass. And here we go. And when you get to the point of a compass, it's in the shape of a diamond. And it's important that we remember that. Okay, next shape. We talk about the diamond represent the 4 great angels and the elements. I combined the 2 into one slide just to make it a little bit more straightforward. And I put a quote from Denver from the priesthood lecture. But graphically, I listed everything, and I went and found some cool clip art of what elements look like, and kind of summarized what all of the directions are, and that pertain to the 4 great angels and the corresponding elements that they're responsible for. And so I'll just read Denver's statement here, and it will explain what graphically I put there on the left. Whoops. Let me get back to it. Okay, so priesthood lecture number 5. This is back in 2013. Now there are 4 great angels who preside over the 4 corners of the earth. Joseph surely knew that. Joseph's letter mentions the names of 3 of the 4, but he leaves out the 4th. He leaves the 4th one out, and I find the absence of the 4th one rather extraordinary. Now, the 4th one's name is Uriel, also one of the Elohim. There are certainly some who do not believe the reason for omitting his name from the letter was because Joseph Smith was Uriel. He says, I do not subscribe to that belief. Although there are those who will absolutely cry heresy and throw dirt on their hair and tear their clothes because they are scholars and they're bona fide, and they know that I'm talking out of my hat. And you wonder when he's saying this, what he's really saying. But I'd remind you that Joseph talked out of his hat too. So he's indirectly referring that he's getting it from a higher source. And we'll talk about what happens when we start seeing things, so to speak. It says that fourth and missing unmentioned angel, Uriel, in mortality, was known also as John, the one who was beloved of the Lord. And so here's the summary. These are the four great angels at the four corners of the earth. Adam is the one at the east. The angel who is considered the one who presides over and has control over the air, which is apt because unto Adam was given the breath of life at the beginning. Raphael is at the south, and he is associated with power of fire, which is apt because of his fiery ascent with his people into heaven. Raphael is Enoch. Gabriel, who's Noah, Gabriel is the angel in the west who has the power over water, which is apt because in mortality he survived through the flood. And Uriel, though not mentioned, is the one who in the north has the power over the earth, which is apt because he remains upon the earth, and he is the guardian at the one gate with Elijah at the other end. Interesting. I love the description. He says, but you could take and leave all that as you will. I find the mention here in this letter by Joseph of these individuals and these powers and these three of who are named, the fourth of whom potentially is unnamed, to be interesting. Though he does mention, quote, diverse angels, from Michael or Adam down to the present time. So here we go. And this diamond represents, you get into this shape because it's directional and there's cardinal points. Diamonds, we're talking about diamonds, guys. And we're building to a point. I don't know if you could see in the back, I kind of put a little slide with the four different angels in the back and kind of a shadowed type thing. Okay, let's go to the cornerstones, the royal stars, and see. And like I say, guys, these are all symbols of the Holy Order of Heaven. So I'm taking the time to go through each one individually. So John Pratt, he mentioned here, he has a different view of one of the constellations here, but he sums it up and does it this way, pertaining to the cornerstone stars, so to speak. He said every day is associated with a star. He said every day. Every star represents a servant of God. There are four bright cornerstone stars. The first is Regulus in Leo the lion, and it represents Adam. There's Fomalhaut in the Pisces Astrinus, in the southern fish, it represents Noah. Antares in the scorpion represents Enoch, Raphael. And Aldebaran in the eye of the bull is the seer Joseph Smith. Now, there's some merging here, and so there's some truth. He says, this is how I understand it. These are the four cornerstones. They've been known forever. They've been called the four royal stars. The Persians and all their ancient people knew there were four cornerstone stars in heaven. They were called the four corners of the earth. The big four were easy. I know the people and the stars because they are in history. There are 360 other stars. How can we possibly know them? And so it goes on to explain and question and answer. And like, listen, you could read that on your own, but notice the different directions here and the constellations in the zodiac. And there's 12 constellations in the zodiac. They're not all of the same size. They're not all 30 degrees. They represent a bigger swath or area, and some overlap the others. And understanding those things is very, very helpful, because we're actually moving into a new point in time with a new heaven and earth that's coming up. And if you get into that, it's pretty significant. And so that's the royal stars that correspond with certain constellations. Okay, I want to go over now what is termed the four corners of the earth. And it's everywhere. And we've all heard this. And so the four corners, Denver stated this in lecture 1. He says, therefore, if you want to find the truth, you have to look at Joseph. Born on the 23rd day of December, the day after the winter solstice, the day in which the sunlight won its triumph over the darkness, the first day in which the hours of light and the hours of darkness began to switch and light begins to prevail. A moment that is reckoned anciently as one of the four corners of the earth. Joseph's coming into the world at that moment was no accident. It was cosmic. And God alone controlled the moment of his birth. And so the north, which is this, represents the winter solstice. The west is the autumnal equinox. The east is the vernal, and the south is the summer solstice. There are seasons, they are and do correspond to celebrations, feasts that we will have again, according to what Denver has stated, as soon as the new temple comes. But there are feasts and celebrations and harvests that pertain to each season, which is considered to be the four corners of the earth. And this, I wanted to make sure that you see it everywhere. And this is from the year 1008 AD. And it's the Star of David, which we're going to get into. But I wanted to highlight there's always four corners. There's always a space, and it's always accommodated by a square, whether it's a 2D square, or like in the Holy of Holies, it moves to a four-dimensional or a cube, or not four-dimensional, well, potentially a four-dimensional, but it turns into a cube there. But there are four corners of the earth. And interestingly enough, a date, point in time represented a corner of the earth, because the wandering stars and the fixed stars and everything are supposed to be for times and seasons, to be able to establish and to orient ourselves. So that's another aspect of this diamond shape that represents a different aspect pertaining to seasons and points in time. All right, the next one. There are four corners of heaven that are also mentioned too. This is the best I could find in the center, with the angels there too. But this is the quote that I wanted to read pertaining to the four corners of heaven and earth. There's four quarters of the earth, and there's the four corners of heaven that he states here. And this is in Nephi's Isaiah, where he is commenting on some certain verses. And he says in the verses, "And I will make all my mountains a way, and my highways shall be exalted." Then he states, making all my mountains a way suggests moving in the high places, being in the mountain of the Lord's house, or having temples available. It presumes there will come a time when temples become available. It foreshadows our day. We live at a time when the mountains are available to be a way, when walking in those highways will make one exalted. Nephi saw these things, knew they would come for us, and wrote his record to bear testimony through Isaiah's words of the unfolding gospel plan of the latter days. Of course, having these things happen requires a gathering. And so Nephi reminds us of gathering in the next verse. And we'll actually talk about gathering down here with this symbol, which is the Star of David. We'll talk about gathering a little bit more. Verse 12, it states, "And then, O house of Israel, behold, these shall come from far, and lo, these from the north and from the west, and these from the land of Sinim." And then Denver comments, "When God has a covenant people, he gathers them. They are always intended to come together so that they can build Zion. Christ would also prophesy about the same latter-day phenomenon. When you find a body of believers, you also find the angels of heaven gathering to minister to them. They talk about where the carcass is, the angels will be gathered, right? The body of believers are us. It says, from the four quarters of the earth and from the four corners of heaven, things gather, and the infinite unites with mankind. All eternity is moved. In the last days, that age-old pattern will be reenacted again. So there's four corners of heaven also. And hang with me, we're almost through some of these bigger symbols. Another aspect with the diamond pertaining to these directions and how it's divided into three each. And we talked about how Israel was divided after they left Egypt last week. But there are the concept of on the laver, or the baptismal font, so to speak. There are 12 oxen that are on there. And Denver stated this about it. And this is building up to a point here. This is back in March 2010. The Temple of Solomon had a sea for washing of the priest. The description of that sea is found in 1 Kings 7, 23 through 26. Significantly, the sea sat upon the backs of 12 oxen. 3 were facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south, and 3 facing east. In the time of the first temple, these 12 oxen foreshadowed the scattering of Israel to the four corners of the earth. The destruction of the first temple completed the scattering, which began at the death of Solomon, who was responsible for the construction of the first temple. That's the temple that I'm always reviewing. It's because it was revealed to his father David. David couldn't construct it, Solomon could. It says, but when he or Solomon died, the kingdom was divided north and south. The northern kingdom contained the 10 tribes, which would be taken into Assyrian captivity at about 725 BC and then be lost to history as they scattered northward. The remaining 2 tribes of the south were taken captive by Babylon at 600 BC. That should be a time that you should remember, according to Lehi. And then a remnant returned. They were finally dispossessed of their land at 70 AD by the Roman destruction of Jerusalem and scattered throughout the Roman Empire. It says, we also build fonts. This is in 2010. In temples with 12 oxen bearing the font of water used for baptisms for the dead. These 12 oxen are also divided into groups of 3 facing north, northwest, south, and east. Now, however, the oxen signify the gathering of scattered Israel. They also signify by their number 3, the concept of presidency or organization under the restored priestly authority. The circle, and we're going to start talking about the circle. This is an octagon. We're also going to talk about that. The circle of the 12 also are a symbol of restored, reorganized Israel and the latter days to once again exist as united people upon the earth. So we have this concept of the directions pertaining to baptismal font and these oxen that we've talked about in like some of the earlier weeks, like week 4 or 5. We talked about those. And so Israel was divided, and the group 10 went north and 2 remained south, as he mentioned. Okay, so now that we've gone over some of these examples or some of these symbols or signs of a holy order or a holy or a higher order, let's talk about this diamond in the full square. Here's the square making up the 2 signs, right? And we have right here, the body is joined right here. And so we have these 2 signs. We're now to the point where a new order or a higher priesthood, so to speak, is going to be received. All of a sudden, this diamond shape, because it's standing on end and pointing north, it becomes a diamond instead of a square. It overlays the square, and this one actually should come to front. Bring to front. That one should be in front. Sorry, I had it The diamond overlays the square, representing a joint ascension process. This has many implications. Soon as we turn the corner here, go into this heavenly space, all of a sudden there's a new order that's revealed, represented by the diamond. The square is important. It gets us to this point where we have to ascend into terrestrial space here, but this one is shifted, and then a new shape appears. This is a shape that could be likened unto this holy order or the higher priesthood. And Joseph Smith, at the end of his life, he talked about that we must learn to become gods ourselves, or themselves, as he stated. So the Aaronic order and the second estate beings need the noble and great ones from this order to teach and administer those ordinances to facilitate their own individual ascension. We actually need to be connected to the powers of heaven, because we cannot be a part of God's family without being instructed first. It is absolutely critical. Joseph Smith sent an extended letter, and he titled it "A Letter to the Brethren Abroad," and talked about how we have to be taught in order to go into a higher state. We just can't arrive there and say, "Hey, teach me." We actually have to be taught before we enter that space. And so these noble and great ones will facilitate those that are willing to see the sign, demonstrate the sign, so to speak. It gets the attention of the holy order or messengers or angels, and then all of a sudden we'll start being under the influence of these holy beings and start being taught. And so there are variations of this symbol that show the square and the diamond overlapping and intertwined, and we'll show you some of them too, that they're intertwined, and we'll get into detail with this symbol right here. But I wanted to make sure that this concept of noble and great ones is mentioned here, and so I just did a screenshot of the book of Abraham at 6:1. It's now TNC 145, and it starts out, "Now the Lord had shown unto me, Abraham, the intelligences that were organized before the world was, and among all these were many of the noble and great ones. And God saw these souls, that they were good, and he stood in the midst of them." We'll talk about the midst of him. "And said, These I will make my rulers. For he stood among those that were spirits, and he saw that they were good. And he said unto me, Abraham, you are one of them. You were chosen before you were born." And so this symbol is a higher order, and it represents higher things. And we'll talk about some of these concepts now. So in order to get to the point where the diamond is manifested, the diamond is the square that's rotated by 45 degrees. Once you do this, a new angle appears, which is very, very symbolic throughout all of nature, through how the universe is organized. This 45-degree overlay of the square reveals the compass itself. When you put it right here, and we'll see the 45-degree compasses are 45. It reveals the compass, which is also 45 degrees, which is one of the symbols on the garment. And I would say that the diamond may represent the Holy Order. I say may, but according to the pattern, it does. It's my belief it does represent the Holy Order, which represents the level 5, 6, 7, and 8. And I'm hoping that you'll start remembering some of these things and where they are if you want to start figuring out the rungs of Jacob's ladder. I'm just giving you a little decoder ring right there. The original square represents the preparatory Aaronic order. It's the square. which represents levels 1 to 4. This image represents levels 5 to 8, right? And note, and it's a key, that each level, and we'll start seeing different shapes, may also be a diamond in and of itself that represents cycles of descent and ascent for one to master the higher laws of the holy order. We truly have to descend to ascend. That's the pattern and the order of Jesus Christ. He truly descended in order to save us so that he could ascend himself. And we'll get into some of that, some of this graphically. And so, restating, the diamond is rotated 45 degrees, or the square, I should say, and this should be square, but I highlighted diamond, is rotated 45, and all of a sudden this new holy order appears because of shapes. And it is a sign and symbol leading to the holy order. And the diamond shape really does represent a higher order of God, if we'll take the time to comprehend it. And so with it, and we're doing pretty good on time. So I'm excited. Good. We'll get through this. I want to go over some of the concepts now of the diamond and how all of a sudden there's this circle that appears also once this diamond appears. And we're kind of accelerating right here. I will put together, a diagram that brings it together, but I want to bridge now and change your mind or change your focus in your mind from now the diamond that is shifted 45 degrees and how a new circle will appear. So the relationship between these two orders right here, the lower order and the higher order, is a key. And they're absolutely an interdependent relationship. And I don't say that lightly. Our hearts must turn to the fathers, and the hearts of the children, or the hearts of the fathers must turn to the children. If we don't have this interdependent relationship of higher order interfacing with lower order, we actually can't ascend. We don't have a classroom, so to speak. We don't have a canvas to paint the picture. We don't have a space that is made available to us. So the first concept right here, and we'll talk about the circle, is how we actually are interdependent with both orders. And I wanted to read Genesis 1:7. And it came to pass that Moses spoke unto the Lord, saying, Be merciful unto your servant, O God, and tell me concerning this earth and the inhabitants thereof, and also the heavens, and then your servant will be content. And the Lord God spoke unto Moses of the heavens, saying, These are many, and they cannot be numbered unto man, but they are numbered unto me, for they are mine. And as one earth shall pass away, and the heavens thereof, even so shall another come. And there is no end to my works, neither my words. For behold, this is my work in my glory, to bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of men. Now Moses, my son, I will speak unto you concerning this earth upon which you stand, and you shall write the things which I shall speak. And in a day when the children shall esteem my words as naught, and take many of them from the book which you shall write, behold, I will raise up another like unto you, and they shall be had again among the children of men, or among even as many as shall believe. These are the words which are spoken unto Moses in the mount, the name of which shall not be known among the children of men. So we get to this point in this progression in these different levels right here. And we have level 5, 6, 7, and 8. So if you keep it in your mind, all of a sudden we have this level 8. Once it's been overcome, then a son takes on the role of a father, and the star of Melchizedek has been received in its fullness. So this star, some call it the seal of Melchizedek. Denver calls it the star of Melchizedek. All of a sudden, when you get to the point of where Christ, and if we're truly going to be saved, we actually have to do exactly what Christ has done, all 8 levels. And for however many eons of time it takes, we don't know. We're supposed to learn that of ourselves. We don't know how many cycles of creation we've been through ourselves and what level we have even attained to ourselves. We'll be able to find out by who's speaking to us, meaning right here. And there's these different that are responsible for each level. And it's really interesting. Anyway, we'll talk about this one later, but I love how it goes from solid, liquid, and then you add some heat and it turns into, you could actually move like a bird, so to speak. But I get in front of myself here. And so we're talking about going all the way around all 8 levels. You have the diamond that has been overlaid, meaning you're in the image of God, so to speak. And then all of a sudden, the star of Melchizedek, you actually possess that star. And this process and pattern is the eternal plan of salvation that is from eternity to eternity. This is the symbol. It's in the temple. It's represented by what you do with your body. This is how a son learns to become as a father, or a daughter learns to become as the mother. And I say this to introduce this circle here. I say this may be why there's a circle in the middle of the star. And we'll get into that. Circles right here, bridging into it, represents an eternal cycle that never ends. And then just key things that I put just to place them in your mind. Jesus only does the things that he sees the Father do. The Father enters into a higher exaltation and the sons become fathers eternally. And so remember, we're now going to start discussing this shape here and introducing the shape of the circle and how it fits into everything and what's supposed to go on and what's supposed to be placed. And it has to do with Zion, guys. It's really cool. So eternity is represented by a circle. There's no beginning, no end. And the star of Melchizedek here is actually not complete until you have a circle in the middle of it. And even another circle in the middle, there has to actually be a star that is placed in the middle of it. And so we learn to become as the Father by descending and then ascending through all 8 levels to inherit all the Father has. And then, not getting into any detail, I wondered how much time we have, but that whole concept in mathematics of pi. The circle in the center may also represent Heavenly Father, around whom the eternal cycles revolve. In mathematics, pi is an endless number, right? And so moving on graphically, here we go. I want to now introduce with the circle, which is a sacred symbol, and introduce the number 13, which is directly related to a circle, and tie it into the star of Melchizedek. And it will come together. And I have one more. So I know I'm going through concepts, but we have to start somewhere. But we're now moving from the triangle to the circle and then the number 13. And so let's give you some examples to make sure that we understand how important the number 13 is. So last week we showed the tabernacle in the wilderness, a painting, a drawing of Numbers 1, and the 12 tribes of Israel surrounded the tabernacle, the one in the center. That makes a number of 13. Venus orbits the sun 13 times in the same time the Earth orbits it 8 times, which is very significant. The movement of Venus viewed geocentrically from the perspective of the Earth creates a rose-shaped flower pattern. And Brooklyn, who's on tonight, she has decided, her and Gabe decided to name her new daughter Lily Rose. So Jen mentioned that we're going to be talking a little about roses tonight. The movement of Venus, when looked from the surface of the Earth, creates a rose-shaped flower pattern. And roses are very, very significant. They have 13 petals, 5 larger and 8 smaller. The 5 are on the outside and the 8 are on the inside. 5 is always a number that represents Christ. The 12 emissaries, oh, so funny, I could put apostles. In the Stick of Joseph, it was updated to emissaries because apostles is off-putting to the Jews. The 12 emissaries or apostles surrounding the 13th person of Christ who stands in the middle. There's 12 apostles, and what is Christ always? He's always in the center. Are you starting to see why 13 is very, very significant? When you have truth at your center, who is Jesus Christ, who stands in the midst, it's complete. And so Christ is that, and we'll see how we actually, we'll get into how it actually develops into the person of Christ. John Pratt talks a lot about the 13-day Trecina cycle as part of the sacred round calendar. There's 2 wheels. One has 20 teeth, one has 13 teeth. And the 13-day Trecina cycle is part of the sacred round, and it repeats endlessly in a circle, right? And the Great Pyramids, as we know, have 13 tiers. There are 13 new moons in a year always. There are 13 gifts of the Spirit, and there's 13 fruits of the Spirit. And you could look at the references. I put them down here so that you could pull them up yourself and read them. These are all Restoration Edition, right? And so with it, here we go, and we'll figure out this third sign given in the temple, and this third sign right here. So interesting to what the right place to introduce certain things are. This third sign given in the temple, and we talked about how you look at it from the side. I've made a covenant not to disclose it, so I have to just leave it to what you've already witnessed yourself. The third sign given in the temple, 135 degrees is the complementary angle to the 45 in a straight line, and we'll get to that in the next slide. So I should have put it in the next one, but take it for what it is. It will make sense as we discuss it. Oh, and the other thing, yeah, so it's a little out of order. I wanted to make sure with the number 13 and talk about the counterfeits. And Satan uses his counterfeits, and number 13 as known culturally as being an unlucky number. And so I gave some examples, and I just pulled it from the internet. 80% of high-rise buildings do not have a 13th floor. Friday the 13th is a tough day for business. They say that businesses lose millions upon millions of dollars because people choose not to do business on Friday the 13th. And a lot of people religiously, they think that 13 was bad because Judas was the 13th guest that arrived. He was late, I believe, is what they state. I've never focused on that aspect, so it's an interesting new perspective to consider. But because of Judas, he arrived. He's the 13th guest at the Last Supper. There's actually video games that related to the 13th guest. And so what does Satan do, even though the number 13, as it helps us to comprehend this circle that comes on and Christ that stands in the middle, because he's the 13th. We have all of these distractions that lead us away from truth. The pentagram is inverted and they say it's satanic, and the hexagram, the serpent, which is a sign of Christ, is likened unto the adversary, and then the rainbow, which is this bridge. We'll talk about the next symbol, which is the Star of David. This rainbow here is also a sign of gay pride or whatever it is. And Satan will certainly use his counterfeits to push us off the trail. Okay, now we're getting close, and I think we're going to be able to end on time, or pretty darn close. This was a labor of love. I went through and did every last angle here so that you could see it, and graphically so you could see how everything goes. I'm going to walk through it. Remember, you'll receive this right now with the hope that it will move from the reception of the information or the sign or the symbol, work to understand and then comprehend it. It takes a while to be able to get it, but I think I could summarize it in a way that I've been able to better understand and begin to comprehend it. And so I want to walk you through how these circles that are there, we have the square that we talked about in detail in week 23 last week, and we have the diamond that we've been talking about, the four corners aspect too, and all of the orders and patterns in the universe that it follows. But now with this, I want to introduce these new angles with the purpose of all culminating with the Star of David here and how it pertains to us in Zion. And so anyway, the 90-degree angles, let's see if we can do this. The 90-degree angles are a step that must be completed with exactness. So if you're going to go from one state of being to the other, and we've talked about these, they have to be followed with exactness according to law, right? Once we act in righteousness according to the pattern, it begins to dawn on us that the 45-degree and the 135-degree angles start and finish each 90-degree angle. In this, when we get to the higher order, you have certain intersections. It's very, very important concept. Now, the 135 degrees right here descends below and above at each junction. And we have a certain star that's called Venus that descends below and above. And I'm not going to say anything more than that, except for that's the 135-degree angle is above and below each junction where the diamond meets the square. So there's these intersections here that you could ponder upon. So notice the 135-degree angle is now the only angle on the inside of the shape made by the two overlapping squares. There's this angle. We need to see what God is calling this 135-degree angle. What is it? And it's made by, and only made by, if both orders are present. You have, this one needs to be on top. You have to have both orders present. And so I just to give a few hints, this may symbolize how we all ascend on the back of the Savior and how the Savior lies between us and Heavenly Father. The eternal circle in the center. There is this buffer zone, and we'll read a scripture that kind of goes over this octagonal shape that is there. The 135 degrees is the intermediate angle between the two shapes symbolizing the mediator, the intercessor. And there we have to actually go into that space, so to speak, to have intercession and mediation in our behalf, so to speak. Like I say, please just receive it at this point. If you take the time, it will start coming into focus, and I'll give a few more clues before we end. And so our personal objective is to complete the full 360-degree cycle in each of the junctions. And I put the compass here on purpose, and it wasn't the perfect size here, but to be able to show what the compass and when it appears in the temple garment, we need to go through each cycle of creation, so to speak, according to the compass that is placed, it's pointed to true north. And then each smaller diamond in the seal is a key. I'll leave it at that. And I state, this can symbolize how the atonement of Christ is the power by which souls descend and ascend, it's Venus, and overcome. This symbol represents how the Holy Order is not a single entity, but a group, or what we've been stated before, a civilization of messengers that teach, expound, and administer to ultimately facilitate the ascension of souls. And I'm hoping it's starting to come into focus. This is an eternal symbol of the ascension of souls and how exaltation is attained through the Genesis 1:5 work. What does that state? Is work and glory to bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of man. So this is the symbol. You have to pause, and you can't receive it in one bite. You have to work to comprehend it. But it's laid out in a way, if you consider what you've learned in the temple and what our responsibilities are once we possess the truth, so to speak, what we're supposed to do. And so that's the star and the 13, right? And the 13 is always Christ at the center. It's a holy number because there is always something at the center that completes something, that makes it eternal, so to speak. All right, the star and the 8. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this one, except to go over this octagonal shape appears here, if you could see it, right? So get all these angles out of there. I want to go over and at least go over the circle, and there's this star and how it is encompassed by 8 sides. And we'll get through it, and then hopefully upcoming, it'll be the box top, and I hope it'll distill in your minds and you'll be able to grab onto it a little bit better. So there is an inner shape in the star or of the star of Melchizedek that acts as a mediator between all the levels of ascension. We talked about this 135 degree that makes up 8 sides, and Jen has been talking a lot about 8 lately. And even my granddaughter, Chloe, has been talking about the number 8 lately a lot. But all of a sudden, you get to this point where the Holy Order, and you're involved in the work, the work of God, the work of the vineyard, bringing to pass immortality, eternal life of men. And all of a sudden, you have another shape that's there. And its 8 is very, very significant. And it acts as a mediator between all the levels of ascension. So when you're going around from levels 5, 6, 7, and 8, there's always this zone that you can go in and be able to access truth and then come back out. So Galatians 1:10 states, "Wherefore then, the law was added because of transgressions, until the seed should come, to whom the promise was made in the law of Moses, in the law given to Moses, who was ordained by the hand of angels to be a mediator of this first covenant, the law. Now this mediator was not a mediator of the new covenant, but there is one mediator of the new covenant, who is Christ, as it is written in the law concerning the promise made to Abraham and his seed. Now Christ is the mediator of life. For this is the promise which God made unto Abraham." And so there's this, when we go around and we fulfill our responsibilities, there's this shape here, and it's octagonal, and it has to do with 8. And I just want to go over some examples with 8, and then we'll move into answering what Tiff was asking about the true order of prayer, and I wanted to get that in. So we'll talk about that in the next slide a bit. But 8 is significant, and I've only put a few. The number 8 in baptism are associated with the age of accountability. 8 souls were saved by the Ark of Noah. Israel's solemn assemblies were on the 8th day. The high priest of the temple, and you wonder why if you know the symbols, because they always represent the same thing. He wore 8 articles of clothing: crown, breastplate, robe, apron, white undergarments, belt, turban, and pants. They call them different: turban, pants, or whatever, but those are the articles. Circumcision was done on the 8th day. Christ was resurrected on the 8th day. The brother of Jared built 8 barges. Nephi and his family spent 8 years wandering in the wilderness. And so 8 is important, and it is manifested in this shape as we go through this process of receiving the higher order, which is the work of the Father, which is the work of laboring in the vineyard. All of a sudden, a new shape or symbol appears that is significant. Now, some of the LDS, and this 8 is very, very well known. This is not something that's hidden. This is very, very well known. A lot of the LDS baptismal fonts are octagonal in shape. And some motifs, and I believe it is the San Diego temple, that the motif is octagonal. It's 8-sided. And so anyway, that's that shape. We didn't go into a lot of information. I gave enough information there that it would help start piecing it together. Okay, so now we have the Holy Order, and here's an interlocking sign, and I have the circle. I just found a graphic and that met it well enough. And think about an altar here that it's at the center, and think about what happens in the LDS temple in this prayer circle, or the true order of prayer. You surround an altar, and at the center there, you're all gathered and interjoined, right? So the Star of Melchizedek, I say may, but according to the pattern, I believe it does represent the true order of prayer. So visualize this star from an overhead perspective and view it as the true order of prayer is being offered as participants are interlocked. And we know what it looks like if you've been through the temple, right? And Christ is in the center, and think about what the function of the altar is. It's the connection point between heaven and earth. It's where Daniel faced to pray. It's the place where all of the prayers traverse across the land and go up. Father's at the center, where we seek him and his blessings in and through the true order of prayer. Now with it, I wanted to introduce, and here's the Masonic sign too, if you go into it too, they'll actually do shapes with their bodies to represent the space that is there at the center, and hopefully that Christ will be in the midst here. And it's really fascinating with the Masons here and the shape and the heart and the mind or whatever, and where it is and how it's interjoined. It's very, very significant, very, very symbolic. But now I want to go over this shape. And you notice I made it 3D view, this Star of David. And this is what we're going to conclude with tonight. It looks like we're going to end right on time. And so let's move on and start talking about the Star of David here. And this is a 3-dimensional, even though a lot are 2-dimensional. And so Denver has talked about the diamond and the Star of David, or what's in this diamond shape once it's there, and what's supposed to be in the center. And I'll read this, and then we'll get to the summary. So in the chiasmus talk, it was American Fork, and it was one of the earlier talks, 2010, that we just barely received in Restoration Archives. So I think, like I mentioned, Christine helped transcribe it, as I remember that was that one. But he stated this: when you take the symbols and overlay them upon one another, you wind up with the symbol that was adopted by David as one of the symbols of ancient Israel, United Kingdom, priesthood, the Star of David. Now, I'm only placing this right here, and these new shapes of triangles, not squares, that have to do with the Urim and Thummim, which have to do with Zion, which have to do with the rainbow, which has to do with the city of Enoch being reunited with the New Jerusalem. This is the symbol of heaven and earth connecting. So I wanted to give it away so your mind doesn't wander. There is this symbol. Once you have the holy order and a space has been created, wow, the Star of David appears. It says, when you place them side by side, if you read the account given by Lucy Mack Smith of the Urim and Thummim were similarly these two triangular shaped, and this is in the stuff that is going to be published. You can find the sites and description in there. That was his parenthetical. It says, let me start again. The Urim and Thummim were similarly these two triangular shaped, set in a bow that Joseph, would look through. And you ought to ask yourself again the question, if the Urim and Thummim has that symbol contained within it, again, the question becomes, why? Why would we wind up with it embedded in the Urim itself, an instrument in which the contact between God and man is to take place? Why would it bear the symbol that appears there? The Urim and Thummim becomes another interesting issue to think about as a device, as a mechanism. Joseph Smith would begin the process of translating the Book of Mormon and using the Urim and Thummim. He found that it was so filled with light. His comment was that I could see everything in looking through it. It was so light or filled with light that he would wind up having headaches because it was physically painful using the device. Later, Joseph would use a seer stone and he would block out the light because it was less painful to make the process. And later still, towards the end of the translation process, the book wasn't even opened. The seer stone wasn't even used because this prop or object, as we've been learning from the lectures on faith, had resulted in Joseph acquiring this capacity. And at the time that we get Joseph in section 76 Revelation, Joseph's just sitting in an upper room dictating the transcript from heaven while in open vision without possession of any instrumentality, because the process has changed the person into being in contact with the heaven, which was the purpose behind it all. I put the question, it's called the Star of David. Who is David? And what does it have to do being at the center, which we're supposed to gather to, which is likened unto Zion? Who is David? And so one more quotation, and then we'll sum it all up. We have a description of the Urim and Thummim from Lucy Mack Smith. She described it as follows. On the morning of September 22nd, after Joseph had returned from the hill, he placed the article, the Urim and Thummim, of which he spoke into my hands. And upon examination, I found that it consisted of two smooth three-cornered diamonds set in glass, and the glasses were set in silver bows, which were connected with each other in much the same way as old-fashioned spectacles. And that's the reference. One of these, Denver states, one of these, quote, two smooth three-cornered stones pointed upward. The other pointed downward. This pattern of two triangles pointing in opposite direction is what the Star of David is made from. One pointing up, the other pointing down. It, too, is a kind of chiasm. Progression and regression set in a side-by-side pattern. The Urim and Thummim is a chiasm. The Star of David was modeled on the Urim and Thummim and is also a chiasm. So what's the Star of David? According to the pattern, it is the symbol of Zion. According to that pattern, it's the center place. It's the gathering place. So I just wanted to put, these are just graphics, and this is the Lucy Mack Smith history, where she, in her own hand, this is taken from the Joseph Smith papers and the Lucy Mack Smith history. but she stated this, and this is a graphic down here below that we used in a week, like week 19 or 18, that pertained to this connection with heaven and earth. But Lucy said this in her journal: Joseph saw this and followed me. Mother, said he, do not be uneasy. It's all right. See here, said he, I've got the key. I knew not what he meant, but took the article in my hands, and upon examining it, with no covering but a silk handkerchief, found that it consisted of 2 smooth, 3-cornered diamonds set in glass, and the glass was set in silver bows. Now, if you look, I blew it up a little bit bigger than the other slide in previous weeks, but if you look at the symbol here, 1 points upward, 1 points downward, and then you could read the Genesis 5:22. Once we have in the middle one that can see, who is a seer, things start changing, and the direction is pointed towards Zion and the gathering. And Genesis 5:22 states, and this is my everlasting covenant that, that I establish with you, that when your posterity shall embrace the truth and look upward, there's the triangle looking upward, then Zion shall look downward. And it's hard to see this. Oh, and I did a screenshot. And all the heavens shall shake with gladness, and the earth shall tremble with joy, and the general assembly of the church of the firstborn shall come down out of heaven and possess the earth, and shall have place until the end come. And here's how it's, the Star of David is in here. It's likened to the Urim and Thummim. Here's the compass, here's the square, and all of these symbols, by the way, these are made to construct a temple so that we can receive those things that we've all been seeking, right? These are those symbols all culminating. And here's the summary. And then I just have 2 slides with supplemental information. The Star of David is the sign of Zion, the 13th object in the center of the circle. This is the Zion where we're supposed to connect with the fathers, the powers of heaven, and they're supposed to look down, and then another cycle starts, and then it goes on and on. Like the mirror, if you've been to the sealing room in the temple, it goes on and on into eternity down in this center place. But this is the order of heaven that must be followed in symbolic state. And remember, Zion is the one, we're talking about the number 13. There's 12 around with the 12 apostles and everything that we discussed. Zion is the one. It's the holy number represented as the 13th. And the Star of David is directly corresponds to the Davidic servant. And with that, there is a Urim and Thummim whereby you can look into it and receive answers, right? So I'm hoping, even though it was a very quick summary, that now we could appreciate more the sign of the square, the full sign of the square, the full square, the diamond, and then the new stars that appear, the Star of Melchizedek and the Star of David that appear as we comprehend these lines, line upon line, precept upon precept. If we'll take the time, become as a little child, revisit our shapes, ponder them according to our experience, get to the point of understanding and comprehending and hopefully possessing that seal of Melchizedek, which is the sealing power. That's the possession that is there. Hopefully all of this stuff will give a better perspective on what's going on in the temple with all of these gestures that you're doing with your body, and what all of the clothing and all of those symbols in that endowment represent, but I'm hoping that these symbols now will make a little bit more sense to us as we review them. Now, in conclusion, I pulled a few things. We saw this earlier, but look at these shapes. And this is from 1000 AD, right? So you have a star upon a star upon a star, but with the four corners here. The aspects of these shapes and symbols, you see the diamond, you see the square, you see another star appear, and the Star of David and everything else. These are universal symbols. The other, what I just wanted to address too, is in this Star of David, go, and I put the reference so that you could go in and do it yourself, but there are certain messianic zodiacal, signs that represent Christ that are pointing upward, and then there are 6 that point downward. All up, all down. Think of the Urim and Thummim, up and down in these cycles. We need to figure out where we are. What star or constellation were we born under? And we start having these things uncovered to us, and it's richly symbolic. If you could start piecing it together, who is the archangel that's responsible for the certain level, or the certain, did I even skip it? Wherever it was. Hold on. Oh, right here. The 4 great angels. We could start piecing things together according to these symbols that will help orient us. Last thing is look at these murals, or whatever they're called. And this is for you to review later, but look at the symbols that are there. You could see certain signs. You could see the angles there, the corners, the 4 corners, right? You could see there's Melchizedek officiating at the altar, and he's in purple robes, offering bread and wine, interestingly enough. Abel, according to the law of sacrifice, offers his lamb, and Abraham offers his son Isaac. What are we supposed to lay upon the altar? And the seal, or the Star of Melchizedek, is located at the center of the altar, surrounded by the Gammadia. Those are the L-shaped symbols, and they're surrounded by the square, so to speak. And the same symbols are found on the veil that is parting to reveal the hand of God. See these symbols right here? The square, and how it all works here. 4 corners. And then all of a sudden a hand comes through, it's extended out, and you receive something. And then this last version, then we'll conclude. This is a little bit different. Melchizedek stands in Abraham's place this time, and there is a cyclical pattern that's right here. I would think that's how Venus is oriented. I'm not sure. But there's Abel offering his sacrifice, Melchizedek offering his, and then we have the seal of Melchizedek right here. And Jen wanted to point out that lilies are there because we have a new granddaughter that will be named Lily. Lilies are important, and Brooke and Gabe recognized that and thought it would be a good thing to name their daughter Lily Rose. And then again, right here, this hand reaching through this veil. So anyway, that's all I prepared. I hope that you'll revisit it. I hope that it just won't be discarded. I hope that you'll ponder line upon line and precept upon precept and revisit this to the point that we could even talk about it even in greater detail later. This isn't all of the information. This is enough to start piecing it together so that we can start understanding and then comprehending it. And with it, we will end it, and I will stop the recording.